Captain Elena Vasquez had always known that war was ugly, but nothing had prepared her for the particular cruelty of being captured behind enemy lines. The mission had started like any other reconnaissance operation: gather intelligence on enemy positions, report back to headquarters, and return safely to base. But somewhere between the mountain pass and the valley below, everything had gone wrong. The explosion that destroyed their convoy still echoed in her ears 3 days later. The memory of watching her team scattered across the rocky terrain haunted her every waking moment. Sergeant Martinez, barely 19 years old, had been thrown 50 feet from the lead vehicle. Lieutenant Jackson had tried to drag him to safety before the second blast silenced them both forever. Elena had been thrown clear, landing hard against a boulder that left her right shoulder aching and useless for hours. When the dust settled and the ringing in her ears subsided, she found herself alone among the wreckage. The radio was destroyed, her weapon was nowhere to be found, and blood trickled from a gash above her left eye. But she was alive, and that meant she had a duty to complete the mission or die trying. For 2 days, she moved through the mountainous terrain, avoiding patrol routes and sleeping in caves. Her training had prepared her for survival situations, but the bitter cold at night and the scorching heat during the day tested every limit of her endurance. Water was scarce, and the protein bars in her survival kit would only last another day. On the third morning, exhaustion finally caught up with her. She had been moving through a dense forest when she heard the dogs barking in the distance. The enemy had brought tracking dogs, and she knew her scent trail would be impossible to hide completely. She tried to reach the river she could hear flowing somewhere ahead, hoping the water would mask her trail, but her legs gave out just as she crested a small hill. The enemy patrol found her collapsed against a tree, barely conscious from dehydration and exhaustion. There were 6 of them, wearing the distinctive gray uniforms of the opposing forces. Their leader, a man with cold eyes and a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, smiled when he saw her uniform. Well, he said in heavily accented English. What do we have here? A lost little bird, far from her nest. Elena forced herself to sit up straighter, drawing on years of military bearing even in her weakened state. She provided only her name, rank, and service number, as required by military protocol and international law. The soldiers laughed at her formal response, and their leader kicked dirt in her direction. "You think this is some kind of game?" he sneered. "You think your precious conventions will protect you here?" They bound her hands behind her back with rough rope that bit into her wrists. The march to their base took 4 hours through increasingly rugged terrain. Elena forced herself to memorize every landmark, every turn in the path, filing away details that might prove useful if she found an opportunity to escape. The enemy base was larger than she had expected, sprawling across a valley floor with multiple buildings and what appeared to be significant military assets. Guard towers dotted the perimeter, and she counted at least 24 vehicles in various states of readiness. This was exactly the kind of intelligence her mission had been designed to gather, but now she was trapped inside with no way to relay the information. They threw her into a small concrete cell with no windows and only a bucket in the corner. The heavy metal door clanged shut, leaving her in complete darkness. For the first time since the convoy attack, she allowed herself a moment of genuine fear. She was alone, injured, and completely at the mercy of people who clearly had no intention of following the rules of war. Hours passed in the darkness. She could hear activity outside, vehicles moving, voices shouting orders, the sound of machinery. Occasionally, footsteps would approach her door, pause for a moment, then continue on. Each time, she braced herself for whatever might come next. When they finally came for her, it was with the harsh glare of flashlights and rough hands that dragged her from the cell. Her legs had grown stiff from sitting on the cold concrete floor, and she stumbled as they forced her down a narrow corridor lined with similar cells. Some were occupied. She could hear movement and occasional whispers, but most appeared empty. They brought her to what had once been the dining hall of whatever building this had been before the war. Long tables had been pushed against the walls, and a single chair sat in the center of the room under a bright overhead light. Around the edges of the room, soldiers lounged against the walls or sat on the tables, creating an audience for whatever was about to happen. The scarred leader from the patrol pushed her down into the chair. "Now then," he said, walking slowly around her. "Let's talk about what you were doing in our territory." Elena repeated her name, rank, and service number. It was all she was required to provide, and all she intended to say. His backhanded slap caught her across the left cheek, snapping her head to the side. Stars exploded across her vision, and she tasted blood where her teeth cut the inside of her mouth. "Wrong answer," he said calmly. "Let me ask you again. What was your mission?" The interrogation continued for what felt like hours. They asked about troop movements, about her unit's capabilities, about strategic positions, and communication codes. Each time she gave the same response, they escalated their methods. First came the slaps and punches, carefully placed to cause pain without permanent damage. Then, they brought out a bucket of ice water, dumping it over her head until her whole body shook with cold. Through it all, Elena held on to her training and her duty. She thought about the oath she had taken when she first put on the uniform, about the soldiers who had served before her and faced similar trials. She thought about her team members who had died in the convoy attack, and she promised herself that their sacrifice would not be meaningless. The scarred leader grew increasingly frustrated with her silence. He paced back and forth in front of her chair, occasionally stopping to lean down and speak directly into her ear. "You think you're being heroic," he whispered. "But nobody is coming for you. Your people think you're dead. You could disappear completely, and they would never know what happened. All we want is a little information, and then this can all be over." But Elena knew better than to trust anything he said. Even if rescue was impossible, even if she never made it home, she had a responsibility that transcended her personal safety. The intelligence she carried in her head could compromise future operations and put other soldiers at risk. No amount of torture would make her betray that trust. As the night wore on, the soldiers around the room grew restless. Some wandered off to get food or sleep, but others remained, watching the proceedings with varying degrees of interest. Elena could feel their eyes on her, studying her reactions, looking for signs of weakness. The scarred leader called for a break just before dawn. They dragged her back to the cell, where she collapsed onto the cold floor. Every muscle in her body ached, and her head pounded from dehydration and repeated blows. But her resolve remained intact. She dozed fitfully for a few hours, awakened periodically by the sounds of the base coming to life around her. Through the thin walls, she could hear engines starting, orders being shouted, and the general bustle of military activity. She tried to piece together what she could from the sounds, building a mental picture of the base's operational rhythm. When they came for her again, the sun was high overhead, and she estimated it was sometime in the early afternoon. This time, there were more soldiers in the dining hall, and she noticed several officers among the crowd. The scarred leader had been joined by a woman in a captain's uniform who watched the proceedings with cold, calculating eyes. Perhaps, the woman said in crisp, unaccented English, "We have been too gentle with our guest." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ice water still dripping from her hair. There was something in the woman's tone that suggested the real interrogation was just beginning. The scarred leader nodded deferentially to the woman, confirming Elena's suspicion that she held higher rank despite her quieter presence. The captain walked slowly around Elena's chair, her boots clicking against the concrete floor with military precision. "Sergeant Rodriguez tells me you have been uncooperative," the captain said. "This disappoints me. I had hoped we could resolve this matter civilly." Elena maintained her silence, staring straight ahead at a point on the far wall. She had learned in survival training that maintaining focus on something beyond her immediate situation could help her endure whatever was coming. The captain stopped directly in front of her chair and crouched down until they were at eye level. "I know who you are, Captain Vasquez. Oh yes, we found your identification after the convoy attack. We know about your unit, your training, your background. What we don't know is why you were in that particular valley at that particular time." For the first time, Elena felt a flicker of surprise. They knew more about her than she had expected, which suggested either advanced intelligence gathering or possibly a security breach within her own command structure. But she maintained her composure, giving no sign that the information had affected her. "Still nothing to say?" the captain asked. "That's unfortunate. Rodriguez, bring in the camera. Elena's stomach dropped as she understood the implication. Whatever they planned to do next, they intended to record it. That could mean anything from propaganda footage to something much worse. The camera was an old military model mounted on a tripod. Rodriguez positioned it carefully to capture both Elena and the captain in the frame, then stepped back and gave a thumbs up. Excellent, the captain said, standing and smoothing her uniform. Now then, Captain Vasquez, let me explain how this is going to work. We're going to ask you some questions, and you're going to answer them. If you don't, we'll find ways to encourage your cooperation. She gestured to Rodriguez, who produced a knife from his belt. The blade gleamed under the overhead lights as he tested its sharpness against his thumb. Elena felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had always known that capture was a possibility in her line of work, and she had prepared herself mentally for this moment. Whatever they planned to do, she would endure it. Let's start with something simple, the captain said. How many soldiers were in your convoy? Silence. I see. Rodriguez, perhaps you could help our guest remember how to speak. The knife sliced through the fabric of Elena's uniform shirt, cutting it open from collar to hem. The soldiers around the room stirred with interest, and Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. But this was still within the realm of psychological pressure rather than actual physical harm. Still nothing? The captain asked. How disappointing. Continue, Rodriguez. The knife moved to her undershirt, cutting it away as well. Elena closed her eyes and tried to retreat into herself, to find the calm center that her training had taught her to access in moments of extreme stress. She thought about her sister Maria, who was probably getting her children ready for school right now, completely unaware of what was happening half a world away. Open your eyes, Captain, the captain commanded. I want you to see this. Elena complied, meeting the woman's gaze steadily. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break down. The room had grown quiet except for the hum of the camera. Elena could feel dozens of eyes on her, studying her reaction, waiting for her to crack. But she had trained for this possibility, had steeled herself against the humiliation and fear that came with being completely vulnerable in front of hostile forces. The captain walked around her chair again, this time trailing her fingers along Elena's bare shoulders. Such discipline, she murmured. Such training. But everyone breaks eventually, Captain. Everyone has a limit. She gestured to Rodriguez again, and he moved behind Elena's chair. She felt him gathering her long dark hair in his hands, and for a moment she thought he was going to cut it off. Instead, he lifted it away from her back, exposing her spine to the room. What happened next would change everything, though Elena didn't understand it at the time. She heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind her, followed by absolute silence. The captain's fingers stopped their movement along her shoulders, and she leaned forward to get a better look at Elena's back. Rodriguez, the captain said, her voice suddenly tight. Bring me a mirror. Now. Elena felt confusion mixed with her fear. Something had changed in the room's atmosphere, though she couldn't understand what. The soldiers who had been lounging casually against the walls were now standing at attention, and she could hear whispered conversations in the local language. Rodriguez returned with a small hand mirror, which he held up so Elena could see her own reflection. But the captain wasn't looking at Elena's face. Her attention was focused entirely on something visible in the mirror, something on Elena's back that Elena herself couldn't see clearly. The captain's face had gone pale, and her hands shook slightly as she reached for something in her jacket pocket. She pulled out a magnifying glass and used it to examine Elena's spine more closely, her breathing becoming increasingly shallow. Mother of God, she whispered in English, then switched to rapid-fire commands in the local language. The room erupted into activity. Soldiers jumped to attention, some running from the room entirely. Rodriguez dropped the mirror, and it shattered against the concrete floor. Through it all, Elena sat frozen in her chair, trying to understand what was happening. The captain stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. She was staring at Elena as if she had seen a ghost, her face a mixture of terror and disbelief. Cut her loose, the captain said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cut her loose right now. Ma'am, Rodriguez asked, clearly confused by the sudden change in orders. Did I stutter, Sergeant? Cut her loose immediately, Rodriguez moved quickly to slice through the ropes binding Elena's wrists, his hands shaking as badly as his commander's. Elena felt the circulation return to her hands, but she remained still, afraid that any sudden movement might change whatever had just shifted in her favor. The captain was backing toward the door, her eyes never leaving Elena's spine. "Get me Commander Petrov immediately," she ordered. Tell him we have a situation that requires his personal attention." As soldiers scattered to carry out her orders, Elena finally allowed herself to hope that whatever they had seen on her back might be the key to her survival. But she had no idea what it could be, or why it had caused such a dramatic reaction. The answers would have to wait. For now, she sat in the suddenly empty dining hall, her torn uniform hanging in tatters, trying to piece together what had just happened and what it might mean for her future. Elena remained motionless in the chair, her mind racing to understand the sudden transformation that had swept through the room. The torn fabric of her uniform hung loosely around her shoulders, and she could feel the cool air against her exposed back. Whatever the captain had seen there had clearly shaken her to her core, but Elena couldn't begin to imagine what it might be. The dining hall had emptied except for 2 guards posted by the door, both of whom kept stealing nervous glances in her direction. They whispered to each other in their native language, but their body language spoke volumes. Fear, uncertainty, and something else, a kind of reverent anxiety that Elena had never seen in enemy soldiers before. Minutes passed in tense silence. Elena tried to use the time to gather her strength and assess her situation. The ropes were gone from her wrists, though red marks and deep grooves remained where they had cut into her skin. Her shoulders ached from being bound for so long, and she slowly rolled them to restore circulation. Neither guard moved to stop her. The sound of heavy boots echoed down the corridor, growing louder as they approached. Elena heard multiple voices, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. The guards by the door suddenly snapped to rigid attention, their faces pale with nervous sweat. Commander Petrov entered the room like a force of nature. He was a large man, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in military service. His uniform bore more decorations than Elena had ever seen on a single person, and there was an aura of absolute authority that made even the air in the room feel heavier. Behind him came the captain who had fled earlier, along with several other officers Elena didn't recognize. One of them carried what appeared to be a thick file folder, while another held an old-fashioned camera with a large flash attachment. Petrov stopped 3 feet from Elena's chair and studied her face with intense gray eyes. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but clear. "Captain Elena Maria Vasquez," he said, reading from a document in his hand. "United States Army, Special Operations Command. Daughter of General Miguel Vasquez, deceased." He looked up from the paper. "Granddaughter of Colonel Isabella Santos Vasquez, also deceased." Elena felt her blood turn to ice. Her grandfather's name hadn't appeared in any official military records for over 50 years. Few people even knew that Isabella Santos had been Elena's grandmother, much less that she had held the rank of colonel. The family had kept that information private for reasons Elena had never fully understood. Petrov folded the document and handed it to one of his subordinates. "Captain," he said to the woman who had fled earlier, "show me what you found." The captain moved behind Elena's chair with obvious reluctance. Using the magnifying glass from earlier, she pointed to something on Elena's lower back, just above where her uniform pants rested on her hips. "Here, sir," she said, her voice still shaky. A birthmark in the shape of a crescent moon, approximately 2 inches long. And just below it, she paused to swallow hard. The scar. Elena felt a chill of recognition. She had always been self-conscious about the birthmark on her lower back, a distinctive crescent-shaped mark that her grandmother had told her was a sign of good fortune. But the scar the captain mentioned was something else entirely. A thin, precise line that ran horizontally across her spine, just below the birthmark. Elena had never known how she had gotten that scar. Her grandmother had always deflected questions about it, saying only that it was from a long time ago, and changing the subject whenever Elena pressed for details. After her grandmother's death when Elena was 16, she had assumed the truth had died with her. Commander Petrov moved around to examine Elena's back himself. She felt his presence behind her, heard his sharp intake of breath when he saw whatever the others had seen. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something she couldn't identify: respect? Fear? Oh, bring the photograph, he commanded. One of the officers stepped forward with an old black and white photograph, its edges yellowed with age. Petrov held it up beside Elena's head, comparing something in the image to her face. Elena couldn't see the photograph clearly, but she caught a glimpse of a woman in an unfamiliar uniform standing beside what appeared to be a military vehicle. The resemblance is unmistakable, Petrov said quietly. The facial structure, the eyes, even the way she holds herself. He paused. And the birthmark and scar confirm it beyond any doubt. Elena's mind was reeling. Who was in that photograph? What did her grandmother have to do with these people? And why did the sight of her back cause such terror in hardened military officers? Petrov walked back to face her directly. When their eyes met, she saw something in his expression that she had never expected to see from an enemy commander. Genuine respect, mixed with what might have been fear. Captain Vasquez, he said formally, I believe there are some things about your family history that you were never told. Elena found her voice for the first time in hours. I demand to be treated according to the Geneva Conventions, she said, her voice hoarse but steady. I am a prisoner of war, and I have rights under international law. Petrov actually smiled at that, though there was no humor in it. My dear Captain, you are many things, but a simple prisoner of war is not one of them. He gestured to the man with the file folder. Tell me, what do you know about your grandmother's service record? Nothing, Elena admitted. She never talked about the war. I imagine she didn't, Petrov said. Colonel Isabella Santos Vasquez was one of the most decorated intelligence officers in the history of warfare. She also happened to be one of the most feared. He opened the file folder and pulled out several more photographs. These were clearer than the first, showing a young woman who looked remarkably like Elena. She wore a uniform Elena didn't recognize, and in some of the photos, she was standing alongside men who were clearly high-ranking officers. Your grandmother, Petrov continued, was known by several names during her active service. To her friends, she was Bella. To her enemies, she was La Sombra, the Shadow. She specialized in deep reconnaissance and counterintelligence operations behind enemy lines. Elena stared at the photographs, seeing her own features reflected in the face of the young woman. But it was impossible. Her grandmother had been a gentle, quiet person who spent her retirement tending a small garden and reading romance novels. You're lying, Elena said. Petrov shook his head. I wish I were. Your grandmother was directly responsible for the failure of Operation Silver Fox, which cost my country dearly during the Cold War. She infiltrated our highest levels of command and extracted intelligence that led to the destruction of an entire network of our agents. He pulled out another photograph, this one showing a group of soldiers standing around what appeared to be a crashed aircraft. She also orchestrated the rescue of 37 Allied prisoners of war from a facility very much like this one. The operation was considered impossible, but she found a way. Elena felt the world shifting around her. Everything she thought she knew about her family, about her grandmother, was being rewritten with each new revelation. But, Petrov continued, perhaps more importantly to our current situation, your grandmother made certain promises during her final mission. Promises that were sealed with blood and honor, and that carry forward to her descendants. He gestured to one of his officers, who stepped forward with what appeared to be a ceremonial dagger. Elena tensed, but Petrov held up a hand to indicate she wasn't in danger. This, he said, taking the dagger, belonged to your grandmother. She carried it throughout her service, and it was present when she made a sacred oath to my grandfather, General Alexei Petrov. Elena's eyes widened as she realized the implication. This man wasn't just any enemy commander. He was the grandson of someone who had known her grandmother personally. Petrov turned the dagger over in his hands, and Elena could see intricate engravings along the blade. Your grandmother saved my grandfather's life during the chaos following the war. She could have killed him, perhaps she should have, but instead, she chose mercy. In exchange, he swore a blood oath that he and his descendants would honor any member of her family who bore the mark. What mark? Elena asked, though she was beginning to understand. The crescent birthmark and the scar beneath it, Petrov explained. The scar was made by this very blade when your grandmother and my grandfather sealed their pact. They shared blood, and that blood was passed down through their children and grandchildren. Elena felt dizzy. The idea that her grandmother had been involved in some kind of blood oath with an enemy general seemed like something out of a fantasy novel, not reality. Your grandmother knew that war creates cycles, Petrov continued. She understood that children and grandchildren would grow up to fight the same battles their parents fought. The oath was meant to break that cycle, at least for our families. He placed the dagger on a nearby table and stepped back. The terms of the oath are simple. Any descendant of Isabella Santos Vasquez who bears the mark is to be treated as family, not as an enemy. Their safety is to be guaranteed, and they are to be given whatever assistance they require. Elena looked around the room at the assembled officers. They were all watching her with the same mixture of respect and uncertainty she had seen in Petrov's eyes. "I don't understand," she said. "Why would my grandmother never tell me about this?" Petrov's expression softened slightly. "Because she hoped you would never need to know. The mark was meant to be a last resort, protection for her descendants only if they found themselves in the most desperate circumstances." Elena thought about her grandmother's gentle hands tending her garden, the way she had hummed old songs while cooking dinner, the bedtime stories that had always featured brave heroes overcoming impossible odds. Had there been hints all along that Elena had simply been too young to understand? "The blood oath includes certain obligations," Petrov continued. "I am bound by honor to ensure your safety and to provide you with whatever assistance you require. But the oath is also conditional." Elena felt her brief hope falter. "What conditions?" "You must prove that you are worthy of your grandmother's legacy. The protection of the oath extends only to those who demonstrate the same honor and courage that Isabella Santos Vasquez showed throughout her life." Petrov began pacing slowly around her chair, his hands clasped behind his back. "Your grandmother's final mission was to broker a peace between our peoples. She believed that understanding and respect could overcome the hatred that had divided our nations for generations. The oath was the first step in that process." Elena was beginning to see where this was heading. "What are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to complete what your grandmother started," Petrov said. "The war that brought you here is part of the same cycle of violence that she tried to break. There are elements on both sides that profit from continued conflict, that see peace as a threat to their power." He stopped directly in front of her chair. "Your grandmother left behind more than just a blood oath. She left behind intelligence, names, locations, financial records, everything needed to expose the war profiteers who manipulate both our governments." Elena felt a surge of skepticism. "And you want me to help you access this intelligence?" "I want you to help me use it to end this war," Petrov said simply. "The choice is yours, Captain. You can honor your grandmother's memory and work to build the peace she envisioned, or you can remain a prisoner of the same cycles of violence that claimed so many of her generation." Elena looked around the room again. These men had been her enemies just hours ago, but now they were offering her a chance to end the conflict that had already cost so many lives. It seemed too good to be true, which immediately made her suspicious. "What guarantee do I have that this isn't just an elaborate trick to extract intelligence from me?" she asked. Petrov smiled, and, for the first time, there was genuine warmth in it. "The same guarantee your grandmother had when she chose to trust my grandfather instead of killing him. Honor, Captain. Sometimes, honor is all we have." He gestured to his officers, and they began filing out of the room, leaving Elena alone with the commander. When the last man had gone, Petrov pulled up a chair and sat down facing her. "Your grandmother once told my grandfather that the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons," he said quietly. "They're fought with choices. Every day, we choose whether to continue the cycles of hatred that our parents taught us or to find a better way." Elena studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. But she saw only weariness and what appeared to be genuine hope. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "what happens to my mission, my duty to my country?" "Your mission was to gather intelligence that would help your country win this war," Petrov replied. "What I'm offering you is the chance to gather intelligence that could end it entirely, which serves your country better." Elena had to admit there was logic in his argument. But the idea of working with enemy forces, even for noble purposes, went against everything she had been trained to believe. "I need time to think," she said. Petrov nodded. "Of course. But time is something we may not have much of. There are forces on both sides that would see you dead rather than allow you to complete your grandmother's work. The blood oath protects you here, in this place, with these men. But its reach is limited." He stood and moved toward the door. "I'll have quarters prepared for you, suitable for someone of your unique status. Take the night to consider what I've told you. But remember, Captain, your grandmother's greatest victory wasn't won on any battlefield. It was won in a moment just like this, when she chose trust over suspicion, hope over hatred." As the door closed behind him, Elena was left alone with her thoughts and the weight of a family history she had never known existed. The room seemed different now, no longer a place of interrogation but a crossroads where her grandmother's past and her own future intersected in ways she was only beginning to understand. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the base settling into evening routines. Guards changing shifts, vehicles being secured for the night, soldiers returning to their quarters. It all seemed so normal, so routine, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought her here. Elena touched the spot on her lower back where the mysterious scar lay hidden beneath her torn uniform. For her entire life, it had been nothing more than an unexplained mark from childhood. Now, it might be the key to ending a war and fulfilling a promise made by a grandmother she had thought she knew. The choice ahead of her was unlike anything she had been prepared for in military training. There were no protocols for situations like this, no clear guidelines for how to proceed when family history collided with military duty in such a dramatic way. As night fell over the enemy base, Elena sat in the empty dining hall and tried to imagine what her grandmother would have done. The answer, she suspected, might determine not only her own fate, but the course of the war itself. Elena spent the night in quarters that were far more comfortable than anything she had expected from an enemy facility. The room was simple but clean, with a proper bed, a small desk, and even a window that looked out over the valley below. Someone had left fresh clothes on the bed, civilian clothing that fit her perfectly, suggesting they had taken careful measurements during her unconscious moments. More unsettling than the comfortable accommodations was the respect with which she was being treated. The guards who had escorted her to the room had actually saluted before leaving her alone. A meal had been brought to her, real food, not the slop typically given to prisoners, along with medical supplies to tend to her injuries. As she cleaned the cuts and bruises from her interrogation, Elena tried to process everything she had learned. The photograph of her grandmother kept flashing through her mind. The young woman in the image had looked so much like Elena that it could have been her own reflection, but there had been something in those eyes that Elena recognized from her childhood memories, a steel core beneath a gentle exterior. Elena had always known her grandmother was strong. Isabella had raised Elena's father as a single mother during difficult times, had worked 2 jobs to put him through school, and had never complained about the sacrifices she made. But the idea that this quiet, gentle woman had been a legendary intelligence operative seemed impossible to reconcile with Elena's memories. Yet the more she thought about it, the more small details from her childhood began to make sense. Her grandmother's uncanny ability to read people's intentions, the way she could move through their house at night without making a single sound, her insistence that Elena learn languages and martial arts, because knowledge is the only weapon they can never take from you. There had been other things too. The way her grandmother would sometimes stare off into the distance with a haunted expression, the nightmares that would wake her in the middle of the night, the locked trunk in her bedroom that Elena had never been allowed to open. Elena had assumed these were just the quirks of an old woman who had lived through difficult times. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of her grandmother as a young woman navigating dangerous missions behind enemy lines. In the dreams, Elena watched Isabella make impossible choices, seen her risk everything to save lives and preserve peace. She woke several times during the night, each time more convinced that Commander Petrov had been telling the truth. When morning came, Elena found fresh water for washing and a breakfast tray waiting outside her door. The guard who brought it was a young man, probably not much older than Elena herself, who looked nervous about the interaction. "Commander Petrov requests your presence in his office at your convenience, ma'am," he said in careful English. Then, hurried away before Elena could respond. Elena took her time getting ready, using the delay to organize her thoughts. She needed to approach this meeting with the same strategic mindset she would bring to any military operation. What were Petrov's true motivations? What did he hope to gain by involving her in whatever scheme he was proposing? And, most importantly, how could she serve her country's interests while honoring whatever promises her grandmother had made? Petrov's office was located in the main administrative building, up 2 flights of stairs, and down a long corridor lined with portraits of military officers from various eras. Elena recognized some of the uniforms from her military history studies, spanning conflicts that went back over a century. The office itself was spacious but spartanly furnished. A large desk dominated the center of the room, flanked by filing cabinets and a conference table. Maps covered one wall, marked with colored pins and notations in multiple languages. But what caught Elena's attention immediately was the display case against the far wall. Inside the case were military decorations, medals, and what appeared to be personal effects from various conflicts. But prominently displayed in the center was the ceremonial dagger Petrov had shown her the day before, along with a faded photograph of 2 people shaking hands over what looked like the same blade. One of the figures in the photograph was clearly a younger version of Petrov's grandfather. The other was unmistakably Elena's grandmother, though she appeared to be only in her 20s. Both were in uniform, and both bore visible wounds, suggesting the photograph had been taken shortly after some kind of battle. That picture was taken 3 days after the armistice that ended the Kelvin conflict. Petrov said from behind his desk, "Your grandmother had been wounded during her final mission, and my grandfather was recovering from injuries sustained when his unit was overrun." Elena approached the display case for a closer look. In the photograph, both her grandmother and Petrov's grandfather looked exhausted but determined. There was something in their body language that suggested mutual respect despite their opposing sides in the conflict. They met in a field hospital that was treating wounded from both armies. Petrov continued. "According to my grandfather's journal, they spent 3 days discussing philosophy, strategy, and their hopes for the future. When they parted ways, they made the blood oath you learned about yesterday." Elena studied the dagger in the case. The blade was beautiful, with intricate engravings that seemed to tell a story in symbols she didn't recognize. What do the engravings mean? They're old symbols representing protection, honor, and the bonds between families, Petrov explained. Your grandmother added her own mark to the blade, a small crescent moon near the handle. Look closely. Elena peered through the glass and could indeed see a tiny crescent moon etched into the metal near the base of the blade. It was identical to the birthmark on her back, confirming yet another piece of Petrov's story. Your grandmother believed that wars are often fought by the wrong people for the wrong reasons, Petrov said, moving to stand beside Elena at the display case. She and my grandfather both lost friends and family members to conflicts that could have been avoided if the right people had been willing to talk to each other. Elena turned away from the display case to face Petrov directly. What exactly are you proposing, Commander? Petrov walked to his desk and retrieved a thick folder. Before your grandmother retired from active service, she compiled extensive intelligence on what she called the war machine, the network of arms dealers, corrupt politicians, and military contractors who profit from prolonged conflicts. He opened the folder and spread several documents across his desk. Elena could see financial records, communication transcripts, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs. This intelligence identifies specific individuals and organizations that have been manipulating both our governments to maintain this conflict, Petrov continued. They sell weapons to both sides, provide intelligence that prolongs the fighting, and ensure that every peace negotiation fails before it can succeed. Elena studied the documents, recognizing some of the names from her own military briefings. How do you know this intelligence is accurate? Because your grandmother continued gathering information long after her official retirement, Petrov said. She maintained contacts in both our intelligence services, and she updated her files regularly. Some of this information is less than 6 months old. Elena felt a chill as she realized the implications. If her grandmother had indeed been gathering intelligence on both sides, it would explain some of the questions that had always surrounded the family's finances. Isabella had lived comfortably in retirement despite never having held a high-paying job. The intelligence is hidden, Petrov continued. Your grandmother was too careful to leave it somewhere obvious. But she left clues for her descendants. Clues that only someone with the mark would be able to interpret. Elena looked up from the documents. What kind of clues? Petrov smiled slightly. The kind that requires someone who thinks like Isabella Santos Vasquez. Someone who has been trained in the same strategic thinking, the same attention to detail, the same ability to see patterns that others miss. Elena realized what he was implying. You think I can find this hidden intelligence because I'm her granddaughter. I think you can find it because you're her worthy successor, Petrov corrected. The blood oath doesn't just protect you, Captain. It also charges you with continuing her work. Elena walked to the window and looked out over the valley. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from what might have been another military installation. The war was continuing while she stood in this office, debating the merits of a plan that seemed too good to be true. What happens if I find this intelligence, and it proves that war profiteers are indeed manipulating the conflict, she asked. Then, we expose them, Petrov said simply. Both of our governments have individuals who would act on this information if they had it. People who are tired of being manipulated, who want to see real peace negotiations instead of theatrical performances designed to fail. Elena turned back to face him. And what happens to the soldiers who are fighting this war? What happens to my unit, to my friends who are still out there? They get to go home, Petrov said. Both sides. That's what real peace means, Captain. No more casualties, no more families destroyed, no more young men and women dying for the profit margins of people who will never set foot on a battlefield. Elena could hear the sincerity in his voice, but she also recognized the complexity of what he was proposing. Even if they could expose the war profiteers, ending a conflict required political will that might not exist. How do I know you're not just using me to access intelligence that benefits your side? She asked. Petrov returned to the display case and opened it, removing the ceremonial dagger. He held it reverently, turning it over in his hands. Because, he said, my grandfather made me swear the same oath he swore to your grandmother. I am bound by honor to put the cause of peace above the interests of my own side. If I betray that oath, I dishonor not only myself but 3 generations of my family. He extended the dagger to Elena, handle first. This belongs to your family now. Your grandmother left it in my grandfather's care until one of her descendants could claim it. Take it, and you accept the responsibility that comes with it. Elena stared at the offered weapon. Such a small thing to carry such enormous implications. If she took it, she would be committing herself to a path that might be considered treason by her own command. If she refused it, she might be passing up the chance to end a war. I need to know more about these clues my grandmother supposedly left, she said, not yet reaching for the dagger. Petrov nodded and set the weapon on his desk. The first clue was the mark itself, the birthmark and scar that identified you to us. But there are others. Your grandmother mentioned a garden, a place where she buried more than just plants. She spoke of books with hidden meanings and photographs that tell stories beyond what they show. Elena felt another chill of recognition. Her grandmother's garden had been her pride and joy, but she had always been oddly secretive about certain areas of it. And her personal library had been extensive, filled with books in multiple languages that seemed to have little connection to each other. Where are these things now? Elena asked. According to our information, your grandmother left everything to your father when she died. He may have kept her possessions, or he may have distributed them to other family members. Elena knew that her father had indeed kept most of her grandmother's belongings. They were stored in the basement of the family home, boxes and boxes of items that had seemed too precious to throw away, but too painful to examine closely. Even if I could access these items, I'm currently trapped behind enemy lines with no way to communicate with my own forces, Elena pointed out. Petrov smiled. That problem, at least, is solvable. The blood oath requires me to provide whatever assistance you need. If you decide to pursue this path, I can arrange for you to return home safely. Elena stared at him in disbelief. You would just let me go? More than that, Petrov said. I would provide you with an escort and safe passage through all territories under my command. The oath is very specific about protecting Isabella's descendants. Elena realized that Petrov was offering her something she hadn't dared hope for, a way home. But he was also asking her to take on a responsibility that could change the course of history. "I need time to think about this," she said. "Of course. But while you're thinking, consider this. Your grandmother spent the last 30 years of her life working toward the peace that she and my grandfather envisioned. She gathered intelligence, cultivated contacts, and prepared for the day when her descendants might be able to finish what she started." Petrov picked up the dagger again and held it out to Elena. She believed that wars don't end because politicians sign papers. They end when ordinary people decide that they've had enough of dying for other people's profits. Elena looked at the weapon, then at Petrov's earnest face. Everything about this situation defied her training and her expectations. But she couldn't deny the logic of what he was proposing or the possibility that her grandmother really had been working towards something larger than anyone had imagined. "If I take this," she said slowly, "what exactly am I committing to?" "To honor your grandmother's memory by seeking the truth," Petrov replied. "To use whatever intelligence you find in the service of peace rather than continued warfare. And to trust that sometimes former enemies can become allies in the pursuit of something greater than victory." Elena reached out and took the dagger. The moment her fingers closed around the handle, she felt a strange sense of connection to her grandmother, to the history she had never known, and to a future that might be very different from anything she had imagined. "All right, Commander," she said. "Tell me exactly what you have in mind." Petrov's relief was visible as he smiled and gestured toward the conference table. "Let me show you everything we know about your grandmother's final mission and everything we hope you might be able to accomplish." As they settled down to begin planning, Elena realized that she was about to embark on the most dangerous mission of her career. Not because of the physical risks involved, but because success would require her to question everything she had believed about duty, loyalty, and the true cost of war. 3 weeks later, Elena stood in the basement of her childhood home, surrounded by boxes that contained the remnants of her grandmother's life. The journey back to friendly territory had been surreal, traveling under enemy escort through multiple checkpoints, each commander they encountered showing the same mixture of respect and fear when Petrov displayed the ancient documents that confirmed Elena's protected status. Her commanding officers had been suspicious of her sudden reappearance, of course. Elena had stuck to a carefully prepared story about escaping from enemy custody and making her way back through hostile territory. The debriefing had taken days, with intelligence officers grilling her about everything she had seen and heard during her captivity. She had told them about the enemy base's location and capabilities, information that would undoubtedly be acted upon. But she had said nothing about Commander Petrov, nothing about the blood oath, and nothing about the mission her grandmother had left unfinished. The ceremonial dagger was hidden in her personal effects, wrapped in cloth, and tucked away where no one would think to look for it. Now, with a week's leave to recover from her ordeal, Elena was finally free to begin searching for the clues her grandmother had supposedly left behind. Her father had been puzzled by her sudden interest in Isabella's belongings, but hadn't questioned it too closely. He was simply grateful to have his daughter home safe. The basement was cramped and dusty, filled with the accumulated possessions of 3 generations. But Elena's grandmother's boxes were clearly labeled and carefully organized, even after all these years. Elena started with the box marked personal papers, hoping to find something that might point her in the right direction. Most of the documents were exactly what she would have expected: birth certificates, insurance policies, medical records, and correspondence with various government agencies. But at the bottom of the box, wrapped in oiled cloth, Elena found something that made her pulse quicken. It was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The writing inside was in her grandmother's careful handwriting, but it was written in a code Elena didn't recognize. Numbers and symbols filled page after page, with occasional words in what appeared to be Spanish, English, and at least 2 other languages. Elena photographed several pages with her phone, then carefully re-wrapped the journal and set it aside. If this was indeed the intelligence Petrov had mentioned, she would need help decoding it. The next box contained her grandmother's personal effects, jewelry, photographs, and mementos from her long life. Elena found herself studying each photograph carefully, looking for hidden meanings or coded messages. Most showed family gatherings, birthday parties, and other ordinary events. But one photograph stood out from the others. It showed her grandmother standing in front of a garden, but not the small vegetable garden Elena remembered from her childhood visits. This was a formal garden with elaborate flower beds arranged in specific patterns. In the background, Elena could see part of a building that she didn't recognize. She turned the photograph over and found a note in her grandmother's handwriting, "Where roses bloom in memory of those who cannot speak." Below that was a set of numbers that might have been coordinates. Elena felt a surge of excitement. This had to be one of the clues Petrov had mentioned. But where was this garden, and what significance did the flower arrangements have? She continued searching through the boxes, finding more photographs of the same garden taken from different angles. In one image, she could clearly see that the flower beds were arranged in a specific pattern, shapes that might represent letters or symbols when viewed from above. The next breakthrough came when Elena opened a box labeled Books and Literature. Her grandmother had been an avid reader, and Elena remembered the extensive library she had maintained. But these weren't the romance novels and biographies Elena remembered from her childhood visits. These books were technical manuals, histories of military conflicts, and treatises on intelligence gathering. Many were in foreign languages, with handwritten notes in the margins. But what caught Elena's attention was a travel guide to Switzerland, heavily annotated with notes and markings. Elena flipped through the travel guide, noting that several locations had been circled or highlighted. Hotels, restaurants, and tourist attractions were marked, but so were banks, government buildings, and what appeared to be private residences. One page had been folded down to market, and Elena found herself looking at a description of a private botanical garden near Geneva. The description mentioned that the garden was open to visitors by appointment only and specialized in memorial plantings for victims of various conflicts. Elena compared the photograph she had found earlier to the picture in the travel guide. It was definitely the same garden. She pulled out her laptop and began researching the Jardin de la Memoria in Geneva. What she found made her pulse quicken. The garden had been established in the 1950s as a private memorial to intelligence operatives who had died during World War II and the Cold War. It was maintained by a foundation that seemed to have connections to multiple intelligence services. More importantly, the garden's website mentioned that it contained a special section dedicated to female operatives whose contributions had been classified for decades. Elena was willing to bet that her grandmother was commemorated somewhere in that garden. But there was a problem. The garden was by appointment only, and the website indicated that appointments were difficult to obtain without proper credentials. Elena couldn't exactly walk up and announce that she was the granddaughter of a legendary spy. She was pondering this problem when her phone rang. The number was international, but she didn't recognize it. Captain Vasquez? The voice was accented but spoke clear English. "Who is this?" Elena asked. "A friend of your grandmother's. I believe you have been looking for something that belongs to your family." Elena felt a chill. Very few people knew she had returned home, and fewer still would know about her search for her grandmother's hidden intelligence. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said carefully. "The garden photographs were found, yes? And the travel guide to Switzerland." Elena's heart raced. Someone had been watching her, or had access to information about her search. "Meet me tomorrow at the coffee shop on 5th Street, near the university," the voice continued. "Come alone, and bring the journal you found in your grandmother's papers." The line went dead before Elena could respond. Elena stared at her phone, mind racing. This could be a trap, but it could also be the breakthrough she needed. Someone clearly knew about her grandmother's intelligence work and was willing to help her access it. She spent the rest of the day researching the coffee shop the caller had mentioned. It was a small, independent establishment frequented by university students and faculty, public enough to be relatively safe, but quiet enough for a private conversation. That evening, Elena called the secure number Petrov had given her before she left his custody. The call was answered on the first ring. "Captain Vasquez." Petrov's voice carried clearly over the encrypted connection. "I was hoping to hear from you soon." "Someone contacted me," Elena said. "Someone who knows about my grandmother's intelligence work." There was a pause. "Describe the contact." Elena related the details of the phone call and the appointment at the coffee shop. When she finished, Petrov was quiet for a long moment. This was expected, he said finally. Your grandmother maintained a network of contacts throughout her retirement. Some of them have been waiting decades for someone from her family to begin this work. How do I know this person can be trusted? Elena asked. You don't, Petrov said bluntly. But the blood oath protects you from your grandmother's allies as well as from her enemies. Anyone who knew Isabella Santos Vasquez personally would honor her descendants. Elena felt somewhat reassured, but she still planned to take precautions. The next day, she arrived at the coffee shop 30 minutes early and chose a table that gave her a clear view of all entrances. She ordered a coffee and pretended to read a newspaper while observing the other customers. At exactly the appointed time, an elderly man in a well-tailored suit approached her table. He was probably in his 70s, with white hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Captain Vasquez, he asked in the same accented voice from the phone call. Elena nodded, and he sat down across from her. My name is Dr. Heinrich Weber, he said. I worked with your grandmother on several occasions during the Cold War. Elena studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. But his eyes held the same mixture of respect and sadness she had seen in Petrov's expression when he spoke of her grandmother. You have the journal? Dr. Weber asked. Elena nodded and discreetly slid the wrapped package across the table. Weber unwrapped it carefully, glanced at the first few pages, then rewrapped it and slid it back to her. Excellent. Your grandmother was always thorough in her record-keeping. He leaned back in his chair. I suppose you want to know what that journal contains. Commander Petrov told me it contains intelligence about war profiteers, Elena said. Weber nodded. Among other things, yes. But, more importantly, it contains the names and locations of people who can act on that intelligence. People in positions of power who have been waiting for the right moment to expose the corruption that prolongs these conflicts. Why couldn't you access this information without me? Elena asked. Because your grandmother was very careful about security, Weber explained. The journal is written in a code that requires 2 keys to decrypt. One key is hidden in the memorial garden in Geneva. The other key is something only her direct descendants would possess. Elena frowned. What kind of key? Weber smiled slightly. Your birthmark, Captain. The pattern of the crescent moon on your back corresponds to a mathematical sequence that your grandmother incorporated into her encryption. Without both the garden key and your biological key, the code cannot be broken. Elena felt a mixture of amazement and frustration. Even in retirement, her grandmother had been planning for contingencies that spanned decades. How do we access the garden key? She asked. Weber reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Your grandmother made arrangements. There is a contact in Geneva who has been maintaining her memorial plot in the garden. He has instructions to provide access to any of her descendants who can prove their identity. Elena opened the envelope and found a letter of introduction written in multiple languages, along with official-looking documents that seemed to establish her right to access her grandmother's memorial. The process will take several days, Weber continued. But once you have both keys, we can decode the journal and begin implementing your grandmother's final plan. Elena looked around the coffee shop, noting that several other customers seemed to be paying unnecessary attention to their conversation. Are we being watched? She asked quietly. Weber followed her gaze and nodded slightly. Almost certainly. There are people on both sides who would prefer that your grandmother's intelligence never sees the light of day. But you are protected by the same oath that safeguarded her work. Elena felt the weight of the ceremonial dagger hidden in her jacket. The blood oath that had saved her life was now the only thing standing between her and powerful enemies who profited from endless war. What happens after we decode the journal? She asked. Then, we change the world, Weber said simply. Your grandmother believed that ordinary people have the power to end extraordinary conflicts, if they have the courage to act on the truth. Elena thought about her fallen comrades from the convoy attack, about the enemy soldiers she had fought, about Commander Petrov, and his belief that former enemies could become allies in the service of peace. When do we leave for Geneva? She asked. Weber smiled, and, for the first time, Elena saw hope in his eyes. Tomorrow, if you're ready. Your grandmother waited 30 years for this moment, Captain. The world has waited long enough for peace. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Elena realized that she was about to embark on a mission that would either fulfill her grandmother's greatest dream or destroy everything she had worked to accomplish. But for the first time since her capture, Elena felt like she was fighting for something larger than victory. She was fighting for the possibility that war itself could become a relic of the past, and that future generations might inherit a world where the blood oaths of honor were no longer necessary. It was a legacy worthy of Isabella Santos Vasquez, and Elena was determined to see it through to the end. The final phase of her grandmother's mission was about to begin, and Elena carried with her not just the weight of family history, but the hopes of everyone who had ever lost someone to a war that should never have been fought.